Welcome to this Authors in Conversation panel featuring the four 2021 Minnesota Book Award finalists in the competitive memoir and creative nonfiction category. The Minnesota Book Awards is a program of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library in the organization's capacity as the Minnesota Center for the Book. This year's award are sponsored by Education Minnesota and the Memoir and Creative Nonfiction category through the generosity of the Bradshaw Celebration of Life Centers. My name is Karen Babine, and I am the author of two books, both Minnesota Book Award winners in this category, Water and What We Know, Following the Roots of a Northern Life, and last year's winner, All the Wild Hungers, A Season of Cooking and Cancer. I'm coming to you from Chattanooga, Tennessee, where I teach creative writing. So as we get started, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Dakota people, Indigenous keepers of the land on which many of us on this panel recording are zooming in from today. This land was reserved for the Dakota in the Treaty of the Traverse des Sioux signed with the United States in 1851, and it remains sacred to them today. We also acknowledge the Ojibwe people, fellow Indigenous inhabitants of the land. The Dakota and Ojibwe people are the original stewards of story in this place now called Minnesota. The Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, organizers of the Minnesota Book Awards, honor this tradition and the knowledge and values embedded in it as we work to lift up storytellers in our state. For this latest installment of the Minnesota Book Awards popular Meet the Finalists series, I'm pleased to be joined by Kao Yang, author of Somewhere in the Unknown World, published by Metropolitan Books, part of Macmillan Publishers, Carolyn Holbrook, author of Tell Me Your Names and I Will Testify, published by the University of Minnesota Press, Jeffrey Zuckerman, author of Unglued, a Bipolar Love Story, published by Boyle and Dalton, Kaia Solveig Preus, author of The War Requiem, published by Essay Press. Congratulations to each of you for being here. I have been in your shoes and know how exciting it is. So to get us started, I would like to start with a round robin question that I would like each of you to answer. And then I'll have a question for each of you. So each of you is giving voice to people. Some you know well, some who are long gone. Some of you are writing the stories that will become archival research and oral history as years pass. So how is your writing a way of persevering in the world, one that would prefer silence to story, especially in these pandemic times where our relationships to each other are being tested? What is the role of storytelling in this socially distanced world? Jeffrey, can you start us off?
Hi, thanks everybody. Welcome to you all, and thank you for the question. I don't know if I'm going to answer the question, as you said it, but I think I'll give you what I think is a relevant answer about the silence of perseverance. I'm old enough that my grandparents and my mother all lived through the pandemic, the flu pandemic of 1918 and 19. And you know what my brother and I know about it? Nothing. We don't know anything about their experience. We barely even know about the flu pandemic, and I wish I knew now. I wish I knew. How did you get through it? What was life like then? And I don't have that knowledge, and everybody's gone now, so I can't ask those questions. I'll add to that as I write in my book, my father was a refugee from Europe in 1938. And we know so little about his experience, about the death of his sister who stayed behind, and I don't know how many relatives. And again, we don't know how did he persevere before he left Europe, and what was it like when he got over here. Well, I know I was too ignorant and self-absorbed and self-centered to have asked the questions that I should have asked while my parents were still alive. But for that generation, they left it behind, presumably because it was too painful for them to talk about. Well, so I wrote a memoir our kids lived through, and they know most of the story of my wife's mental illness and how I handled it. And I think that's important. And I think it's going to be important for my granddaughter to know that story and others. I already have a authentic relationship with my granddaughter. We had an open and honest conversation this weekend about some twigs that she found in the mud, and then she fell down in the mud and she got all muddy, and she stood up and she persevered. And now we have that story, and that'll be ours.
I like that. I like that. Claire, how does this fit into your work?
Well, thank you for that wonderful question, Karen. It's lovely to contemplate. And I want to congratulate all of my fellow finalists as well. I'm coming to you all from St. Paul. And St. Paul, where the birds are chirping as loud as the conversation of my children outside these doors. So it's an incredible day in St. Paul, Minnesota. It's a day full of stories and story gathering, actually. The kids outside are looking for the first crocuses of the season. And I know they're out there because I saw one. I'm not telling them where. This is the beauty of this experience of motherhood, at least today for me. But in thinking about your question, I think, Karen, for me, I come from people who came with very little to Thailand, to the refugee camps of Thailand where I was born, but for the stories that they carried. So from my earliest memories, it was always the gift that we had to give each other, as my father likes to say, our words and our tears. So I grew up bathed in stories. And I never felt poor, because in all of the moments of quiet, in all of the moments of loneliness, I've been able to draw from these stories that have somehow allowed my life. And in the vein of my elders, I keep stories. You know, this pandemic has been really much a season of gathering stories and holding them close. Not so much writing them right now, because I'm still feeling my way through them. But I imagine that in a year or two, I would get to the page and these stories of loss, of communal grief will come forth, and that maybe then they will be packaged as gifts for future generations. For my particular book, Somewhere in the Unknown World, it was a title that in the beginning, I couldn't have written. I didn't feel equipped. I was so young. I was still learning how to carry the weight of the stories that I had inherited. I didn't yet know that one day I would one day be strong enough to carry the weight of the stories in the world around me. So it's been a process in the making, a process where it came down to one really cold winter's evening when I sat downstairs in the basement listening to the outcomes of the 2016 presidential election. And I realized that all of the reasons why I wouldn't write a collective refugee memoir was because I was afraid. The fear had all of a sudden overwhelmed the faith, this foundation that I've always been able to work from. And so it was a real personal reckoning. My own struggle to survive surfaced in the stories that I would ultimately write for Somewhere in the Unknown World. In that way, the book mirrors my own process of thought, my own struggles as a human being, as an American, as a refugee, somebody who understands that while the home may be limited in size, that the heart is a landscape without boundaries. In trying to communicate all of these things into this book about all of the phenomenal people in the world with me, around me, in the world with all of us, who we can draw strength from in our own moments of weakness.
There's a thread of that collective story in Kaia's book, the natural collectiveness of the choir and voices. How does this storytelling and perseverance and silencing working in your own work?
Thank you so much for that beautiful question and for drawing a parallel to Kalia's work. And I want to congratulate all of my fellow finalists. It truly is a treat for me to be here. I admire your work so much. I feel very grateful to share in this moment with you. And I think that creating these stories from other people's stories is really a beautiful thing that requires us to be humble and open and reflective. And I know that when I was researching these lives of these two men that I had never met, who had died decades before I was born, being able to read their stories, it was like I was stepping into a portal, into these lives, into these worlds that, you know, I haven't seen, but I have by virtue of also being a human in the world, trying to survive, trying to make art. And So I found that it was so important for me to think about my work. I wanted to be very respectful in trying to write about these other people's lives. But I wanted to record my thoughts about them and how I could grow a relationship with these two men. That I've never met and that I will never meet, but that I know deeply in some way. And so by putting that down on paper, I was able to create my own portal. And that feels so powerful and magical, especially when I think about just the depths of loss, both in my book with Wilfred Owen experiencing World War I, Benjamin Britten living through World War II, not fighting and dealing with his own guilt around that. And then, you know, when I think about the backdrop of this year and all of the loss that we've endured, and I think I really relate to what Kalia said about not being able to write about it now, but perhaps later, once we've all moved a little bit, you know, away from this experience, maybe it will turn into something. And for me, you know, maybe it won't so clearly, but everything we live through becomes part of our creation. And I'm thinking especially about that New York Times article where they had the list of names and just a couple details about that person who had passed away. And it's in those details that we get to see this picture of this life that is full and rich. And just having anything down on the page, I think, is a gift for people who come after us, because it allows them a portal into that life that we otherwise would not have gotten a glimpse of. So I really feel like being able to write story, it's miraculous. It's a gift.
And I would agree with that completely, which is a nice segue into Carolyn's work. The idea of stories as a portal. Can you tell us a little bit about how storytelling and persevering is working in yours?
Well, you know, kind of like Jeff was saying about his parents, my parents' generation didn't talk much either. They didn't talk about the experiences they had, you know, living as Black people in America. And, you know, we would hear little snippets every now and then. You know, I always remember my mother talking about a day that she was locked out of their home. Her parents had died when she was 11 years old, and she was left with relatives, and how she wasn't able to get into the house one day, and it was really, really cold, and she almost froze to death, but she wouldn't go any farther than that. And just these little snippets from both of my parents I would hear, you know, and would just make me want to know about their lives. And I never got to know about their lives because they just wouldn't go there. I believe it really was too painful for them. But, you know, in their inability to talk, they left us without this knowledge, without a lot of knowledge that I think we could have benefited from, about, you know, where we come from, you know, our family. You know, we know a lot about the larger history, but about our own personal history. And so I feel like in my telling stories through memoir, telling stories of my life and that which I could figure out about my family before me, and then also, you know, stories about my children, I am leaving something for my kids and my grandkids so they will know where they came from. And I'm always, to this day, inviting them to ask me questions. You know, anything that you want to know about where you come from, you know, please ask me. And if I know the answer, I'll tell you. And if I don't know, we will figure it out together. It's just so important, I believe. Story is just, as everyone, you know, is stating, it's just so important for, you know, people to understand each other. And, you know, in Kaia's case, the people that she researched and will never know. It's just so vital. And yeah, I think that, you know, in the things that happened, the multitude of things that happened in 2020 with the pandemic, with George Floyd, with, oh my gosh, the whole reckoning of that the world came to, in addition to the opposite stuff. you know, I think that we're going to probably benefit from some amazing stories that will be coming out, that we don't see just yet. So yeah.
Well, that's actually a really good segue into the specific question that I have for you, which is about the intersection of story and place. That story is often inextricable from the place that we are experiencing it or the place that we come from. And it's a really evocative phrasing to say, I will tell you anything you want to know about where you come from. And so what struck me in reading your book is how the stories you're telling are uniquely Minnesotan. And you're writing about there's a quote about these I can tell you firsthand that the feminist articles and books published back then, such as The Feminine Mystique and the translation of The Second Sex, meant nothing to colored girls coming of age in South Minneapolis. And so, considering our timing right now with the trial, starting up now, the structural racism that you write about is inextricable from place. And so I'm hoping you could talk a little bit more about that relationship, about where you come from, whether it's physical, geographical place or something else.
Probably geographical and more. I grew up a few blocks from where George Floyd was murdered. And Minneapolis, and in South Minneapolis, and that area is pretty much what I know in terms of where I go back to in my writing. It's just where my heart and my soul are placed. But on another level, I'm also considering the place where the place is, I should say, where my people come from. That I don't know that much about. And I just don't feel like I can separate my stories from where I am or where I was. And at the same time, the quote that you mentioned about the excuse me, the feminist writings back then, again, what I knew was my sister and I, and growing up in South Minneapolis, but it wouldn't surprise me at all to hear other women in our age group who live in other places, other Black women, say the same thing, that those books meant nothing to them because of, where we come from as a people.
Well, as you were writing it, was there anything in the writing of it that surprised you about how story comes out of place?
Oh yeah, very much. Very much.
Do you have a moment you can talk about?
I wrote this book over a period of about 30 years. It's some of the writings are from, when my kids were teenagers, and, I had to go back and, take a look at, well, how do I feel about that now? I had to do a lot of then and now stuff with the earlier writings, and the more recent ones, not so much. But, there was a lot that surprised me in terms of where I went when I look back at some of the things that I talked about in the book.
Well, I also think that idea of perspective and distance is pretty important, which is a good segue into talking about Kalia's book. And I'm thinking a lot about this idea of storytelling as witness. And I go back to Carolyn Forché's introduction to her poetry anthology, Against Forgetting, where she writes that a poem of witness is both an event and the trace of an event. And that's really how I read the refugee stories in your book. And so we've got a twofold moment of the story itself, but then the writing of it seems a little bit like it's its own thing. And so I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about storytelling as witness and how you see that working in your book.
That's It's at least threefold. And before I go there, I wanted to say this about place and stories, Carolyn. The site where George Floyd was murdered was my first, the site of my love story. I'm a St. Paul girl, but I fell in love with a Minneapolis boy. And it was there that we first started our life. And at the site, and I believe not just of murders in the present tense, but of murders past, present, and future. That was where we, this interracial couple, was beginning to find our footing as a couple. That intersection was where in countless fights, we'd walk in different directions because he wanted to get food from the co-op and I wanted to get food from Cup Food so we could feed more people. We could have more food with the limited income that we had. And so all of these stories from this place are just, places hold so many stories. Who could have thought that from beneath the hot sun of Thailand, that there would be this Hmong girl living out a love story in this place of so much, but I think that also gets to the heart of my response to you, Karen, and your question. So these stories I knew were around me. These people were people in the refugee community of the Twin Cities. And I wanted to home it here because there's this fact about Minnesota that very few people know about. Minnesota is not high up for diversity, but we're number one in terms of refugee resettlement per capita across the nation, And so I wanted to focus this conversation that's generally, on the coast, right here in the Midwest, the American heartland. And I wanted to focus on these stories that I did and did not know, from people who could write their own stories and then people who might not be able to. For example, Segmuda Bonsai, whose mother's story and her own story is in the book. She's a wonderful playwright and an author in her own right. But I think Segmuda trusted me with the story because she knew that what I would offer would not be a mirror. It would not be a reflection of the story, that I was in fact offering a portraiture of it. I couldn't control what these individuals were telling me, and I didn't. When I asked for the stories, I said, tell me the 3 most important stories of your life, because I wanted to know. It didn't have to be about the becoming or the refugeeism or the first, notion of America. What are the 3 most important stories from your life? And I let people go at it however they needed to. And then, these stories lived inside of me for a year, Karen. Right after that initial draft where I made sure that the things that I was hearing and registering were indeed the things that they were giving me. That very first transcript of the conversations, I let it stew for a whole year before I went back and I crafted the collection, knowing certain things that I wanted to start with other people's children, because that's generally how we think of people we don't understand, and by the end of the book, you're getting to this very intimate letter to my children. The very last lines of the book are for my 3, who when they look in the mirror may not see that they're a refugee, might not see their mother or their grandmother, whose stories in that book, Natalie's Same Old Tired World, and a story about this refugee woman suffering from PTSD and other forces, American forces, capitalist forces, And so there are all of these things that I was balancing in the book. But the one thing that I knew I wanted to do, first and foremost, above and beyond everything else, I wanted these individuals to see themselves through my eyes, to feel themselves through my beating heart. That I thought would be a gift, my personal gift. And then if these stories could be of use for them and their families and their communities for years to come, that would be an even bigger gift. And if these stories make it into the world, and if the world would accept them as part of the world, then we would understand that we do not have to look to the silver screens or the names on the newspapers to find the heroes that we need, the lights that we need to hold the darkness at bay. These are all of the things that I was doing. And the tracing that happens every time I open the book and I enter into a story, I'm all caught up again. And not only the writing and the hearing, but the trials and tribulations, the beating hearts across these cities, who are here in this world to be found, whose stories, through my one voice, I think, will live on in somewhere and will travel many, many elsewheres. That's my fondest hope. And I think that was the reason why these individuals trusted me with their stories, individuals who, like Sigmund, could write their own story, or Mr. Michael, who perhaps couldn't, but his children, his daughters, who went to Carleton with me, surely they can. They have the ability. But it is the fact that it is a portrait. It is my personal gift as an artist to these individuals that I think is also a part of this whole project that few people don't see when they look at it beyond the power and the magnitude of the stories, that it was these tiny little gifts that I was packaging from my heart.
Well, and I think too about the idea of like, how do we tell hard stories, and how do we grapple with something that hurts in a way that can, as you did, make it useful to other people, which is what Jeff is doing. And so one of the things that was really resonant with me as I was reading was that I have a friend who writes fiction who tells her students that you only have a scale of 10 to work with. So if your subject matter is an 8, then you only have 2 left in your language to work with. That, you know, if the subject matter is really emotional, your language needs to balance that. And so, Jeff, you did a really great job working with that. Can you talk a little bit about how do you work with something that that hurts, that is both your story but also not your story?
Yeah, my answer to some extent is that I used a lot of humor in the book, and a lot of people have told me that the book is funny, which was really gratifying to me, both as a writer and that, and somebody, I think I'm a funny guy, and I'm glad they like my sense of humor, but I'm also glad that the humor they found to be compelling and as a way to get through a really difficult story, and a way to, you know, to handle that, that difficult, intense ride. I wouldn't have wanted to have read a book like mine if it weren't funny. And I had some great role models in other books that I've read about mental illness that worked well for me. And I mentioned Nora McInerney and Ellen Forney, who's a graphic novelist, a graphic memoirist, and artist. And I just loved her book, and it was really funny with the graphic component to it as well. I'll say that early on, a couple of my friends who read very early drafts said they didn't like the characters. And, you know, I didn't take it personally, even though I was one of the characters, because it was a matter of the author not making the characters likable enough and to want to be invested in the book. So one thing that I did was I told some old stories. I added old stories about when Leah and I first met 30 years ago, and they were funny stories, and our relationship was funny, and we shared a so-called sense of humor. And I think it helped make the characters more likable. There's also a lot of self-deprecating humor in there, which wasn't hard because I didn't know what I was doing. So it was easy for me to make fun of myself because I was terrible at a lot of things. And the good thing about that was it added to the humanity of what I was writing and to the real experience that family members go through when somebody in their family has a mental illness. I want to say that you're talking about a broader question in a way that's kind of, to me, more interesting than just about my book. It's about a Jewish sensibility toward adversity and absurdity. I grew up on the subversive humor of the Marx Brothers, Three Stooges, Mad Magazine, Bugs Bunny, Joan Rivers. It was a mocking kind of humor. It was self-mocking. It mocked Nazism. It mocked WASP power. And that is a way that American Jews for the last century probably now have dealt with the adversity that we experience. And in my case, it was the adversity of my wife's late onset bipolar disorder and those circumstances around it. And so I think through humor, I took on that adversity. One other thing I'll mention is that there's also absurdity. What I experienced in my 60s now is just absurd. there were absurd experiences. There was a Brugger's bagel shop incident. There was the leftover salad on the roof of the car incident. They were absurd. And so to write about the absurdity from that angle, I think made for compelling storytelling and also helped me keep my head together to recognize the absurdity in the adversity. Last thing I'll say about all this is that in our NAMI support group, we go through at the beginning of each meeting, 12 principles of support. And number 4 is we embrace humor as healthy. And that's something that I take very seriously.
That's a great answer, because even deeply emotional things are not awful all the time. And it's important to recognize that's valuable too, especially towards healing. So, and so Kaia, what I'd like to know is a little bit about the research of this book, but particularly the role of research in curiosity and inspiration. So I'm curious about the surprises that you encountered as you were doing this research. But I'm also curious about the relationship between the stories preserved in the letters and all of that, and how you reconstituted them into the narrative, and how that creation of these 3 braided lines is also an act of preservation.
What an awesome question, Karen. I'm so excited to talk about this. Thank you. I really love research. And it's funny because I really didn't always. When I think about high school and college, and when I was assigned these research papers, projects, I remember feeling so frustrated because I felt like I was trying to find the answers to questions that had already been answered. And I just felt like I kept running into walls and it wasn't exciting to me. But when I started writing and researching the War Requiem, it really just started with questions of curiosity that I thought were very basic, that turned out to be quite profound, and huge questions like, who was Benjamin Britten, the man who wrote this piece of music? Why did he write it? How did he write it? Those were kind of my guiding questions. And I really followed my curiosity and I really trusted myself and what I was interested in. And I found that the more I researched, the more I felt compelled to write. And it really all started with the letters by these 2 men. I checked out from the library these huge books of letters that they had written throughout their entire lives. I read well over 1,000 letters by Benjamin Britten and by Wilfred Owen. And those letters were so amazing because I got to hear their voices. And even though they had been long dead, they were so present and so alive to me. And I felt like I could really commune with them. And I found myself asking questions to the pages as I was reading, like, how did you feel in this moment? Or you mentioned you're looking out, over a field in France. What field in France was that? What would that look like? What flowers would be there? What color were they? I just found myself trying to paint almost these images out of very disparate, tiny little nuggets of their lives. And so when I think about how I love how you say like reconstituted these letters into scenes, and what I would do is I would read these letters and I would take notes in my notebook about what interested me and what stood out to me. And then I'd go back and I'd circle in a green marker. I remember it was a green marker, the things that felt like heartbeats to me or hotspots, things that I was really drawn to write about or try to imagine. And I remember there's one scene that I write about in the book where Wilfred Owen is working on his poetry and he's writing a letter to his mom. And he's eating a piece of vanilla cake that she had sent him. And there was something about that vanilla cake that was so particular and sweet. And I could just feel it, him sitting in that tent and, worrying, and there's all this bloodshed all around him, but he has this moment of solace with this vanilla cake. And that really drew me to the page, and I wanted to write that scene. And so every scene that's in the perspective of Benjamin Britten or Wilfred Owen, every scene has its heart, in fact, from the letters. I never spun something out of nothing. I always tried to be rooted in fact, rooted in place. When I started the book, I really, you know, I'm ashamed to say I didn't even know the years of World War I or World War II. And I had to start by making bullet pointed lists that I tape up on my walls of, you know, okay, who were the allies? Who were, you know, who was involved? What did the uniforms look like? And by the end, I had learned so much, and I just wanted to keep learning. I just wanted to keep diving in, and keep opening up these worlds. And I think the biggest surprise of all for me was the fact that, you know, I started writing this book in graduate school. I was living in Virginia. I was living alone in a different part of the country, and I was pretty lonely at times. And when I would spend time with these two men, I didn't feel lonely anymore. I felt like I could hear their voices just in the next room, and they were there for me whenever I wanted to open up those books of letters and engage with them. And that was magical. It was wonderful.
That is a great answer. And thinking too about, you know, as we sort of wrap up, thinking about how we keep listening to stories and how they keep us company in these days when we don't get to be around the people that we normally would. And so I am so grateful to get to talk to all four of you about your books. They are wonderful, and congratulations to all of you for being a finalist. If you enjoyed this talk, you can find a treasure trove of past events archived on the YouTube channel of the Minnesota Book Awards Steward Organization, the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. You can find out more about future programs on their site, thefriends.org. In particular, mark your calendars for Thursday, April 29th. That's the evening that the winner in this literary category and 8 others are finally revealed, and it will be online. Attendance is free, but registration is required. So you can visit thefriends.org/MNBA to reserve your spot. Thank you all of you for being here. I have really loved this time talking to you.